Okay. Good morning, everybody. I'm Fiona Goodwin from the EAUC. Welcome to this evidence gathering event from the Climate Commission for UK Further and Higher Education leaders and students. This particular priority area is focusing on deep adaptation. We are recording this session. I will keep you all muted whilst we have the presentations. Then there will be an opportunity to open the floor, so you can just either unmute yourselves to ask a question, or you can put questions into the chat box. If you are using social media, please can you use the hashtag #EduClimateCommission. We'll put that in the chat for you as well. Joy Carter, Vice Chancellor from University of Winchester, and Gail H.E., representative on the Climate Commission, is going to be chairing this meeting. You have all received the briefing paper, so we assume that you have read all of that, and we have included biographies of all the speakers on there. So we will crack on straight through. We'll be asking each of the questions to the speakers to answer in return, and then we'll move on to the next question, and then on to the next question, and then we will open up. So I shall hand over to Joy, who to kick us all off. Thanks, Joy.
Thank you, Fiona. And do we have all our speakers with us now?
Yes, we do.
That's good. So welcome, everybody. It's great to have you here with us for this really important topic. I'm going to say a little bit about each of the speakers very briefly, and then we'll start with the questions. So first of all, Professor Jem Bendell. Jem, welcome. Thank you for coming here. Jem is Professor of Sustainability Leadership at the University of Cumbria, and you'll have read something of his bio. He is well known and well respected in the field of deep adaptation, and indeed yesterday was giving a lecture, an open lecture, about deep adaptation in universities. And Jem, I listened to that in the evening on YouTube and enjoyed it very much. And I hope some of that will emerge today and that we can question you about it. Alison Green, Director of Scientists Warning, a very energetic and values-driven individual who it's delightful to have here. Alison, thank you for finding time to be with us. Dr. Justine Huxley, Chief Executive of that wonderful organisation, St Ethelburga's Centre for Peace and Reconciliation in London. It's a pleasure, Justine, to have you with us, and I know you're doing lots of work on deep adaptation in your own organisation. And Caroline Hickman, Climate Psychology Alliance. Caroline, your work has never been more needed, I guess, and we are just incredibly grateful to you for being with us today. So let's carry on with the questions. I'll go through those, and as Fiona said, then I'll hand over to Alex Bowles, who will manage the questions more widely. So please keep a record, all of you, of any questions you have as we go through each of the speeches from these individuals. So the first key question is, what responsibilities should universities and colleges have in introducing concepts of deep adaptation to their students? That's a really big question, and I expect our speakers could spend the whole day talking about that. But if I can ask you just to give a brief initial response, and then there will be opportunity later to follow up. So perhaps we'll go in the order in which I introduce people. So Jem, would you like to start with that question?
Well, I think to begin with, it's important to identify that we're talking about.
Jem, we can't hear you very well.
If I hold this here, do you hear me any better?
Perfect. That's perfect.
Okay. All right. Sorry, I'll start again then, as you couldn't hear. So I think to begin with, it's important to identify we're talking about the probability or inevitability of catastrophic changes in societies of our students in their lifetimes. And that's a very shocking starting point for ourselves as well as them. And I think it's important for us to know now that that's not an unusual view. It's certainly a contested one, but many more scientists are now expressing that. So for example, I just want to quote from a letter in The Guardian on May the 10th from 12 climate scientists. And they said, I quote, "It's game over for preventing dangerous climate change now that governments are planning the cheapest and quickest return to consumption. Time to acknowledge our collective failure to respond to climate change identify its consequences, and accept the massive personal, local, national, and global adaptation that awaits us all. So as that outlook exists, and it's going to affect all our students, I think it is a responsibility to bring this information to them, whatever their course of study. So you might think, why would an engineer or a historian or a medical student need to learn about this at university? I think it's because the university exists not only for training people in a subject, but actually exists to support people in their personal development. And I think that's become slightly less clear with sort of almost like the neoliberal reshaping of the university and our imaginations, where we're becoming like trainers, entertainers, and certified students. But actually, I think personal development is very important.
I'm so sorry to stop you for a moment. We've got some feedback, and
yes.
The sound quality is not brilliant. Do you have something switched on nearby that you could turn off?
I will change headphones.
So we've had a message to ask everyone to mute, and that will help the sound. So I think Fiona's done that anyway, haven't you? Yes. So.
Yeah.
So we're going to try some new headphones.
I'll go back to my old headphones. Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, so much better. Thank you.
Why did I even bother with new ones? Oh well. So yeah, you got the basically universities. What are we for if we're not just trainers, entertainers, and certifiers? We're for the personal development of students, and therefore it's really important to provide spaces at universities for people to hear this information and not just hear it, but actually alongside ourselves. I mean, this is tough stuff for ourselves. Actually, work out what does this mean for our lives? How are we going to live with this? How are we going to actually integrate this into our choices going forward? So for me, it's important to integrate, definitely. The container for that is important. I've had my 2 minutes. Sorry you didn't hear me properly.
No, it was good. Thank you very much, Jem. I should have said at the beginning when I introduced Jem that I'm a student of his. I attended one of his courses recently, and I have to say I thoroughly enjoyed it. So thank you for that. Alison Green.
Hi, hello everyone. Thanks for having me here. I endorse much of what Jem has just said there. So I will pick up on some of those points, and then I'd like to talk a little bit about specific responsibilities. But for me, universities should be thought leaders, and there's never been a time, a more pressing time for them to raise their game, to actually demonstrate that they can be thought leaders. And I have been very disappointed over the past couple of years in terms of what I've observed, and universities continuing to run under a business as usual kind of proposition, and assuming that things will continue as they currently are. And I'm reminded of an event I went to in London. It was organised by HEPI, the Higher Education Policy Institute, where one speaker spoke to an audience of very distinguished and very eminent academics, and talked about what was an existential crisis. And there was not a single question. It just simply fell flat. And I was shocked and I was angry, because people in higher education who should be thought leaders were not taking this seriously. And it's true that the climate and ecological crisis is upon us at the moment right now. And I think what universities have kind of forgotten is their raison d'etre, why they're here. I mean, they should be thought leaders, but what universities have become are very adept in terms of churning out knowledge, but they have not been very good at solving problems of living. So they're solving problems of knowledge, but not problems of living. In terms of responsibilities, I had a quick scan of university mission statements, and I had a look at OFS, Office for Students, and the regulatory framework. To me, it seems that the framework itself is no longer fit for purpose. So when we come on to what we can do, I'll say a little bit about that. University mission statements are very disparate. Some are pretty good and centred on civic duty and societal good. So for example, the University of Edinburgh and Winchester Joy, I had a look at Winchester's mission statement, and I thought that was quite good. But others are still focused on excellence in research and excellence in teaching, and that's no longer fit for purpose. So in terms of responsibilities then, there are four main areas for me. I think there's the civic and social responsibility, basically to make the world a better place, or framing it slightly differently, to try not to make things worse. And I think there's no doubt that some universities are continuing to make things worse. I think there's a duty of care to students, to the well-being of students. And for me, the starting point there is to tell the truth, which is one of the, you know, as an XR Extinction Rebellion mantra. Never has that been more important. You know, universities have to raise their game. They have to take that responsibility and tell the truth. So it means that a declaration of climate emergency in and of itself is insufficient. There has to be an action plan as to what that actually means and what universities collectively will do. So I'll say a little bit about that in the what universities can do. I think universities have a duty to not missell qualifications. So qualifications at the moment are predicated upon an assumption that the future will be pretty much like the present. I don't believe that that's going to be the case. I believe that we will see significant disruption. And I think there has to be a very, very hard look at curriculum and its fitness for purpose, or fitness for future purpose. And then finally, I think universities have a duty to not make things worse. And that for me means they must go beyond setting out an ambition to achieve net zero in operational terms. They have to raise their game. They have to become thought leaders. So those are the 4 areas that I've set out in terms of where I see responsibilities. It's not exhaustive, I could go on, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Alison. Justine, are you out there in the ether somewhere?
Yes, I am. Hi there, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. Good to see you all. And obviously, I really endorse everything that's been said so far. And I think somewhere this question, as we're having this conversation about deep adaptation, it feels as if, you know, I'm talking to a converted audience. So I hope I'm not repeating too much of what's already been said. Yeah, so, you know, I really believe that we need people in all walks of life and leadership and all professions who've got the courage to internalize the reality of what's coming and begin reevaluating priorities in their lives and careers and communities accordingly. And universities are committed to the pursuit of truth. So really it's a question of integrity for you to be able to begin assimilating the reality of climate breakdown. And I was also going to quote from the same piece that Jem mentioned, which I thought was a really important piece of writing reported on in The Guardian. And it was a different paragraph that I'd pulled out actually, where the writer said, in this story, it's always 5 to midnight. In the conventional mainstream narrative, the story is it's always 5 to midnight. It's always the last chance to prevent disaster. But in contrast, collective action on climate can only grow out of complete honesty. So it's time to acknowledge our failure to respond to climate, identify the consequences, and go through this process of adaptation. So this business of like, we need complete honesty. We can't get anywhere without that. And the barriers to complete honesty are psychological. So universities are, you know, for the first time in my lifetime, in a position where in order to look at reality, you need psychological support mechanisms in order to help people do that. Because we can't evaluate our priorities effectively from within this web of mainstream denial. So the first thing is to get ourselves out of that web of denial. So the first part of the process would be internalizing the reality. And then the business of repurposing, and I really kind of resonate with this word repurposing, and actually the one sentence in Jem's original paper. Can you still hear me okay?
Yes, yeah, that's good.
The question in Jem's paper about deep adaptation that originally inspired me to lead my organisation down the route that we took was the question, what no longer makes sense? So if we understand, you know, the potential for human extinction, then what no longer makes sense? And as a species, we're still engaged in so many things that make no sense whatsoever. And, you know, I would respectfully say that universities are as guilty of that as any of us. And as Alison was referring to, you know, are they fit for purpose? Are we doing what we're there to do? So in the face of potential human extinction, is history of art relevant? So one of my questions, aspirations, hopes would be if universities can collectively assimilate the reality of the situation and begin repurposing themselves for a future of social and ecological collapse, then incredible things could happen. I mean, you would have a whole generation of young people who were prepared psychologically for what's coming, who were empowered to begin the process of practical adaptation and resilience building. And it could make an immense difference within the UK. So I would say there's a tremendous opportunity within universities, and that there's a real moral duty to begin this work.
Thank you very much, Justine. And finally on this question, Caroline. Caroline, are you out there?
I'm here. Yeah. Hello.
Hello.
Thank you. The joy and the misery of going last is you've all said 2/3 of what I want to say. So I've been busily ticking things off as you talk. I was also going to talk about the scientist's letter to The Guardian last week as a paradigm shift, and about the importance of accepting that it's already too late. And in the briefing paper, I noticed that we said, if we accept we've passed the point of no return. And I think that's the starting point, is that we have to accept that we've already passed this point of no return. In the interest of transparency, I need to also add that I'm a lecturer at the University of Bath, so I really should add that in. And a lot of what I'm going to be referencing as we talk is some of the work that I've been doing with the University of Bath, and also that my research is with children not just in the UK, but also in the Maldives, Bangladesh, Vanuatu, and Africa. So my research is with children over the last 5 years who are on the front line of facing the climate and biodiversity crisis. I'd also like to see us communicate about it in that way, that it's not just climate change that we're talking about, that we're talking about the climate and biodiversity crisis, and also to sort of join up in people's minds the learning, the possibilities of learning from the current pandemic, and to actually start to academically, theoretically, psychologically form those links. And I think this fits with what people have been saying about being thought leaders, and that universities need to be taking a very courageous position there. And so I would talk about being thought leaders, but also the need to be courageous about this, and to go beyond the existing academic paradigm, where you have the academic silo, and then you have the estates silo, and then you have student services silo, and then you have the students silo. And what I would be arguing is that universities provide an extraordinary opportunity to look at integrated knowledge and learning from across all of these sectors. What I want to add a little bit is what, and I think this will come in again later, but it might be helpful here, is what climate psychology can bring to the table to help us think about some of this. And then I want to just very quickly go back to how I think universities could make use of that. So climate psychology is a slightly different approach to how to bring this into learning and thinking and processing and feeling. And the slogan of the CPA, the Climate Psychology Alliance, is about facing difficult truths. And I think that's, people have already been speaking about facing difficult truths, both within the academic world and within the university world, and also transferring that socially and globally. So this is about moving it beyond the individual frame. So what we also do, because of the psychological frame that we bring, and I think people have been talking about the need for psychology and emotional understanding, which is fantastic, and of course I'm going to agree with you, but I think what we're bringing is that psychological frame where we show how to deal with defenses, both individual and collective and institutional and global defenses. This is not just individual defenses that we're looking at. So universities could examine their own defensive structures. They could examine their own socially constructed silence. They could examine their own collusive involvement in poor messaging around this. They could actually, this is about being thought leaders, but it's more than thinking, isn't it? This is also about stepping into that kind of emotional frame, which universities are not always completely comfortable with because of the inevitability of defenses like disavowal and splitting, where we say on the one hand, yes, this is really worrying, but where are you going to get your next research grant from? We need to get beyond that. I think we could also bring to the table a really important way of examining the false binary between hope and hopelessness, and between optimism and pessimism, because those are really destructive narratives, which we need to get well beyond. And the CPA brings, because of the thinking about unconscious process, is able to kind of navigate that false binary. So we have to hold that tension. It's a huge mistake if universities focus on practical teaching without bringing in this emotional content. And a lot of the work I've been doing is with schools and preparing schools and teachers and talking to them about how they navigate that. And of course, schools and teachers are in a position where they're being asked to teach children about climate change in a scientific and geography lesson. And then everybody gets stressed, everybody gets emotional, everyone gets upset. And so what we've been doing is spending a lot of time talking with schools and teachers about how to integrate that emotional message. I also work with a parents group, and it's not a catchy title, but we talk about preparing ourselves to parent into the Anthropocene. And I think universities need to think about education into the Anthropocene, within the Anthropocene, which we are already in. And this is about thinking differently and thinking about future generations, yes, but also joining up that tension between past generations as well as future generations. And universities could sit to communicate across that divide relationally.
Yeah. Thank you very much. That's really good. So it's a great start from you all. Caroline started to address a couple of the next two questions, but just touched on them. So let's go into those properly now. So our next question, before I say our next question, I'm going to invite Jem to give us a definition of deep adaptation. Deep adaptation as a concept is a difficult one. It's one which a lot of people either don't want to hear or haven't yet heard. And Jem, if you wouldn't mind just pausing for a moment and just defining it in your own words for us, that would be really helpful.
Sure. So I introduced the term to contrast it with ordinary climate change adaptation. So there's a bit of an implication in there that maybe that it's a bit shallow, the mainstream adaptation agenda, by which I mean, when people are talking about climate change adaptation at the moment, they're talking about preserving this way of life as if that's possible, industrial consumer societies and such like. So it's dikes, it's flood management and such like. Deep adaptation is an invitation to consider what if our society, our way of life is going to collapse in our lifetimes? What would that mean? How do we begin to even approach that? And it is an invitation away from a quick panicked response like, oh, let's do this or let's do that. It's actually an invitation into a much more vulnerable, open-hearted, open-minded way of being with this terrible news, this terrible information. And so I offered a framework for that, 4 R's, 4 questions: resilience, relinquishment, restoration, and reconciliation. So shall I mention those quickly?
Yes, why not?
Okay, so restoration, resilience, it's what do we most value? Faced with this knowledge, what do we most value that we want to keep? Relinquishment, faced with this outlook, what is it that we don't need anymore, that we can let go of? Otherwise it'll make matters worse. Thirdly, restoration, what is it that in our sort of techno-modern way of life, you know, with this notion that we're progressing as a society and we're super busy and successful, what is it that we've lost from our culture that we could bring back that would actually help us as we go into this difficult future? And the 4th R, reconciliation, with what and whom could we make peace with in the face of our common mortality? And it's basically the idea that whatever we do now, it looks like we're not in control. In fact, perhaps we never were. And so we might lose this one in terms of saving society. It may be absolutely awful for our very species' survival. So how can we stay present to this, stay creative, stay loving and engaged, rather than sort of just turn away from it or give up or panic? So that's the reconciliation, to basically be okay with the fact that we might lose this, but we're going to stay involved anyway.
Thank you very much. So now we get to the how. How do we introduce deep adaptation to our students? And what support might be needed? And the what support might be needed flows into the 3rd question. So perhaps if we focus mostly on the how for this question. Jem, do you want to seamlessly move into that?
Sure. So I think Caroline began to touch on it, and that I think as lecturers at universities, we might be fundamentally handicapped in how we can approach this one. Because if I know many of my colleagues are like me, that we find great solace and confidence in how clever we are, or how clever we think we are. And part of that is an aversion to the idea that we might not be good enough, or aversion to difficult emotions. So it's almost like, I mean, when I think about it, when I was a child, it was when I hurt my back, and it was when also I got eczema, that I became really good at school. And so there's this sort of getting inside your head in order to somehow retreat somewhat and protect oneself. So I do wonder, therefore, whether the first step for us to help students is actually to support each other as lecturers in universities to be able to sit with this very difficult outlook. So I recommend that's not done in a technical way. It's not about getting to know new information. It's about how we can show up together with greater vulnerability and help each other process these difficult emotions. And that can be done online or in person. It can be done in a work context, or some people won't want to do that, so you can help them go and find that kind of support outside of work. The Deep Adaptation Forum that I helped set up, we've developed modalities for those kinds of processes. We call them deep listening and deep relating. And it's only then after that, I think, that lecturers and tutors will be able to bring this kind of way of working into class. And in the residential courses that I've run, as you know, Joy, we try and create a way of being together where we're emotionally open and supportive, so we can then spend time together looking at some of the most difficult, troubling information and explore implications together. But in another instance, I lectured on this to 21-year-olds, and so there wasn't that container, there wasn't the ability to create that container. It was just a one-off lecture, and so in that case, I actually watered down my message, because I don't feel, if it's just presented, it's such a good thing to do. I really believe that you need to provide that space, that way of being together openly, vulnerably, and to be able to talk together. So I'll come on to that a bit more. That's the third question about how we do it a bit more, unless you want to hear more now.
So we'll pause and hear from the others if we may, Jem. Just
okay.
I think what you're telling us is it's hugely important but fiendishly difficult to get this right for our students. And you know, if we can only make a few steps today, that'll be really helpful. So thank you for that. Alison, can we turn to you, please?
Okay, thank you. Right, so some really interesting things have been said so far. When I prepared for this, I kind of did stay faithful to the questions and to the 2 minutes. So I will sort of try and adapt a little as we go along. But I'm reminded of the, listening to Jem just now, reminded of the first time I went to a European Commission meeting. And it was essentially my first sort of big event as an activist, as someone who was sort of moving out of academia into activism. And I didn't really know what to expect. But I knew I was talking to some senior people who were working on environmental and climate issues in Brussels. And they were, as you can imagine, you know, white middle-class men. And what astonished me at the end of the meeting was that people in the audience cried. And I wasn't expecting that at all. And when we spoke with them and asked what was happening, they said, well, you know, they'd been working in their silos and they hadn't realized that other people felt the same way but weren't expressing that. So I do acknowledge that emotional expression and that sense of feeling is really, really important, and how to foster that is an important thing. That said, wearing my hat as a former academic and former Pro-Vice Chancellor, you know, effecting change in big organizations is massively, massively complex, and people keep their emotions locked away under lock and key. They do not bring them to the table. So that in itself is a problem. But in terms of the sort of the pragmatist in me is thinking, well, what can we actually do? Because yes, we might have lofty ambitions and ideals about working with people and unlocking emotions and unlocking perceptions and so forth. Not everyone is open to that. And not everyone accepts that, you know, Jem's thesis, which is that disruption and breakdown is inevitable. So that in itself is very, very contentious, and it's quite hard to lead with that. So in terms of thinking about how far universities should go, well, the question then is, well, how bad is it going to get? you know, and when. So there are those kinds of issues to work around. I think what has to be accepted is the inevitability of some kind of disruption, without getting into the, you know, the contentious area about human extinction in our lifetime and so forth. So one of the things that I feel very strongly about, which can be done, is something which was the focus for a letter that I had published in the Times Higher, and this was endorsed by over 1,000 academics, and Joy, you yourself were one of them. And what that demonstrated was that there's a massive appetite, if you like, there's a massive sense of motivation and need, if you will, for academics and scientists, certainly in the UK, to come together and actually get to work. You know, forget all the talk, forget all about the policy making, forget all about the action planning, yada, yada. You know, let's just get on with it. And the appetite is there, but what hasn't happened is that Universities UK collectively just haven't picked that ball up. Now, unless I've missed it, unless there has been a big discussion within, and Joy, you yourself will know as a Vice-Chancellor, you know, that particular opportunity has not been seized. And this for me is a massive, massive disappointment. So when we talk about climate and ecological emergency, what tends to be missing is the kind of the emotion in our own voices and that sense of real urgency and the need to actually get on with it. So in terms of the to-dos, I would really encourage Universities UK to just get their act together. Joy, I'm not pointing the finger at you. You are a shining light in terms of, you know, being active and being proactive on this front. But Universities UK has got to get its act together, and it's got to accept that adaptation is going to be a significant part of their role in the future. Now, Anthony Sheldon, who I don't normally agree with, wrote an article recently, and he talked about the need for Universities UK to become a much more powerful voice, so that instead of doing the bidding of OFS and the government, that they're actually setting the agenda. And I couldn't agree more. I really couldn't agree more with that. So really what I'm saying very clearly is Universities UK, get your act together. In terms of other specifics, I think that Universities UK could and should work with UKRI, which is the UK Research and Innovation Group, to drive the research agenda. So what I'm not suggesting that there is time to do research on mitigation and so forth, but there is a need for research on adaptation, amongst other things. And this is acknowledged by the Committee on Climate Change. So you're pushing down an open door there. But until universities assert themselves and start to drive the agenda more, then UKRI will continue to do the unthinkable, which is push out research funding into fossil fuel exploration, production and fracking and so forth. And I know this is the case because I spoke to the sustainability head at UKRI, who sort of sheepishly acknowledged this is happening, but it really has to stop. I think Universities UK could work with the National Union of Students, and this is in terms of what I was saying earlier about student well-being. So, you know, every year we see the student satisfaction survey come out. Now, if you look at the indices and the measures that are being used within that, where do they mention well-being? So I think that we need to start looking at I mean, I'm sort of trying to think about familiar frameworks that, you know, that universities use, which would make these suggestions more palatable to them. But you could work with NUS to develop a more fit for future purpose student satisfaction survey. And also I think that Universities UK could develop a revised university league table. So I had a look at this recently, and inevitably it's all skewed towards things like entry, research performance, all of those KPIs. None of them are anything to do with well-being, and none of them are to do with things like energy efficiency, you know, which universities are effectively operationally, you know, net zero, and that needs to be changed. So for me, these, you know, I hate this expression low-hanging fruit, but these are things that Universities UK, that university could easily do. The bigger challenges are going to be that, you know, effecting that kind of change in sort of ethos, and you know, what I would advocate strongly for is a kind of coming together, if you like, of university leadership to actually talk through what are universities for, and that for me is a route into the discussion then about the need for deep adaptation, the need for mitigation and so forth. So I would advocate strongly for some kind of meeting where people put, you know, you put to one side the sort of stiff upper lip and the, you know, the protocols, and actually just be human. Sorry, I've ranted a bit.
That's thank you for that, Alison. Just to say that I do think that both our representative bodies, Guild HE and EAUC, have big roles to play in this. I've always thought that, and they are, of course, founding partners with EAUC and the Association of Colleges in the Climate Commission. So that's a good start, and it's wonderful that they're engaged in that. However, I did just attend a EAUC meeting a few days ago, and there was no mention, and I mean no mention, of the climate and ecological emergency at all. And of course they were focused on COVID-19, and it's important that they should be for the time being, but not to mention the climate emergency at all. I found deeply disappointing. So I share your concerns there. Right, so we need to speed on here to make sure everyone else has time to ask things. Justine, a few words from you, if we might, about how we introduce deep adaptation to students.
Sure, thank you, Joy. So I thought I'd approach this question by saying what we do at St Ethelburgers, to look at how we're adapting that to make it more accessible so it can reach more people, and then look at how that might work in a university environment. So I'll do all of those things in 2 minutes, I think. So the first element of what we offer is the business of stopping, just stopping what we're doing, kind of extracting ourselves from the web of denial and taking ourselves out into a different place where we can actually look at what's going on. The second important element is really to build a very strong container of relationships, because that sense of community is really necessary for us to approach these very difficult topics. So building a container of relationships that can also give space to feelings. So actually that's my third element, giving space to feelings and enabling people to work through their feelings about what's happening. We work then with scoping out the scenarios that may be coming, and the way we approach this gets around what Alison was pointing to as this very contentious theme of extinction. So we look at worst case scenarios, talking about how effective leaders would be always aspiring for the best, but also preparing for the worst. So we elicit from the groups the kind of worst case scenarios that they see as possible within their lifetime. So we don't go into kind of, you know, what's true and what isn't true. We just look at the fears that people are carrying and the possibilities that are within people's thinking. And those elements, of course, include all kinds of things to do with the collapse of food systems, migration, conflict, biodiversity, kind of mental health. And what we've developed at St Ethelburgers is a collection of tools and techniques which enable people to actually physically or in their imagination walk into those scenarios and actually have an embodied experience of that future. And I think that's it's a psychological technique which helps people to internalize it. And I think that element is quite important. And we also look at how people's values affect their ability to walk through that landscape and the resilience that values bring. We also teach about climate justice, because mass migration will be a feature of our future when the ice caps start melting and the 600 million people who live at sea level will start moving. So that mass migration poses a tremendous threat to peace and cohesion of our communities. And we see that educating on climate justice is one way to help support that cohesion, because if people understand that, you know, Western lifestyles are responsible for the ecological collapse in countries in the global south, you know, there's more chance of people feeling empathy and feeling responsible for the migrants that are showing up on our shores and recognizing their humanity. So we see teaching about climate justice as an essential preventative measure for extremism and scapegoating in eco-fascism. So that's an important element of our system. We've used Jem's 4Rs, which I think are a tremendously helpful map for walking through this future. And then we focus on this business of repurposing, looking at, you know, if we've internalized this reality, then how do we repurpose ourselves for a future of collapse? and then work with ongoing mentoring and support and setting up communities of practice so people can support themselves to create change in their own communities. So for us, that's been an intense residential process, which we're now in the process of repackaging for an online environment in small bite-sized accessible chunks, with online tools that can back it up, with support for facilitators and with guidelines for setting up communities of practice. So that's what we're doing, and I'm just really interested to think about how that might be applied to a university, and particularly the first element of our theory of change, which is stopping. And we've been in this pandemic, you know, which is obviously related to the whole ecological situation, and it's given this disruption and this opportunity to actually stop and reevaluate what we're doing. So, you know, my question to you as universities is it possible to actually take the step to commit and do something really radical and just say, okay, we're going to stop everything we do for 2 weeks, and we're going to put everyone, all the students, all the staff, absolutely everyone through a process where we come to terms with what the future is going to look like, and then begin the process of repurposing universities for that future.
Justine,
It's a radical question.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It's a huge challenge to me and my fellow Vice Chancellors, but a welcome one. So thank you very much for that. Caroline, well, we'll let you go first with the last question, because I recognise it's hard to keep going last, but if you could just give us a few words about how we might introduce deep adaptation to our students as a topic, and then we'll ask you to seamlessly move into the next question about building resilience.
Okay.
You could just focus first on how do we introduce it to our students.
I'll try to keep it to a few words, but I can't promise.
That's okay.
I am going to first say something in response to something you said, Joy, about the fact that you were in this meeting and there was a lot of discussion about the virus and no discussion about the climate biodiversity crisis. And I do need to respond to that, because I think we also don't need to just talk about how. I think we also have to do the how ourselves.
Oh, absolutely.
And embody that and model that. So I need to tell you how that feels.
Mm.
And I got incredibly depressed a few minutes ago listening to you say that. And I'm doing a lot of work with children and young people who are in despair at the moment, because the virus has pushed any concern about climate change off the pages of the newspapers. And when I say despair, I don't mean upset. I mean 14-year-olds telling me that they no longer want to live, because they can't bear the abandonment, the betrayal, the short-sightedness, and the stupidity that is being demonstrated. And they clearly articulate this as stupidity. So the how is, we really must be less stupid around this and challenge the stupidity of that separation. And we have to bear that anguish and that rage and that pain and face up to that betrayal and that abandonment of younger people and say sorry to them. So I really think we should be leading on this with the how by saying we're really sorry, because we've got this badly wrong up to this point, which is partly why we're in this mess in the first place. And universities, actually, we're supposed to be fairly intelligent people. We should be demonstrating that, above all else, by bringing in that emotional intelligence into how we address this now, which means we will have to say sorry. Actually, we've got it wrong. We have to have an emotional container for that, but it has to be relational. And if it's not relational, then it won't work. Because the reason I'm saying that is this is not an entirely rational problem. And the problem is universities pride themselves in being rational centers of excellence, but we're dealing with the climate biodiversity crisis, which is not entirely rational. So if we continue to collude with rational responses, then we will just go down the rabbit hole and avoid doing what needs to be done. We have to challenge this academic, intellectual, social, emotionally constructed silence and collusion with stupidity. and with things that are wrong. I listen to this 14-year-old and he just tells me how he feels. And he is more informed than I am on the science. It's exhausting and awe-inspiring and difficult. And I cannot disagree with anything he says to me, except I disagree with his solution, which is to kill himself. So that's the level of despair that we are leaving young generations with if we don't find a way to speak about this now. And there is a degree of disillusionment that has to happen within that. And I think for me, that's the how. Again, I'm trying to stay on message, which is that, you know, we have to face up to the fact we've got things wrong in universities. One thing I've done at the University of Bath, I'll just get a bit more practical for a minute, is we've had open lectures, open talks about this, which are open to staff and students, where I present climate psychology alongside deep adaptation discussions and arguments, and we discuss. So we've had lots of open lectures. Some people are horrified, and a lot of people thank me. We've started to integrate some of our teaching there. So now I think I now teach deep adaptation and climate psychology to chemical engineering students.
Fantastic.
For example, because they want emotionally intelligent engineers for the future, to prepare them for the future. And the students love it. It has to be framed so that they can make sense of it and it's relevant to their learning. They absolutely love it. 3 years ago, I was given 2 hours a year to do this. This year, I was given 8 hours in their masters.
Wow.
Because of the feedback from students, which has just increased. So you can start small, but then feedback from students is incredibly positive. As we know, universities respond to that. This year, I had 8 hours with those students. We have a social science of climate change unit, which is open, cross-disciplinary. We must not separate natural science teaching from psychology. They have to be brought together relationally. And in order to do that, we have to address our own hubris, humility, not knowing, uncertainty, vulnerability. And we have to get to grips with climate anxiety or eco-anxiety and recognize that it's a really good thing to feel this. And it shouldn't be pathologized. We have to do more outreach with schools because those are the generations coming in and universities will relate to that. So I've been doing a lot of talks in schools, and young people in schools, 15, 16, 17-year-olds, are looking for university programs that teach integrated approaches to climate change, and they're looking for them. We should be developing them. We've been in discussion at the University of Bath to do that. We need these spaces, the how in the universities. The Climate Psychology Alliance uses a model of climate cafes, where we come together, no judgment, we sit, it involves tea and cake, and we talk about how it feels, what's going on, what we think, and what we want to do about these things. I've been doing training sessions for groups of university staff, for example, in Exeter, Falmouth, with their counsellors and student services and pastoral care, about supporting the staff so that with their feelings about this, so that they can support students. So we need to provide these training spaces, and I don't mean it's just training. We have to deal with how we feel in order to support students with how they feel. Practically, the how, campuses have to reflect their commitment to this. They should be divesting from fossil fuels, absolutely, in research, but there needs to be this critical emotional intelligence that is unashamed about the fact we should be taking a lead on this. We should be unashamed about this. And we should be listening to 14-year-olds despair whenever we think, actually, this is too complicated. Because if we don't do this now, we're in deep trouble.
Here, here.
In terms of resilience, I can do that very briefly.
Good, thank you.
Shall I just keep going?
Yes, yes, thank you.
I want to be very clear about what we mean by resilience, because I'm not coming here from a positivist psychology perspective of saying, oh, we can fix this if we plant 3 trillion trees. Oh, we can deal with this. No, I'm not coming from that perspective. That is a false message. We have to deal with the fact that we've got to talk about hope without optimism. We've got to talk about what the Climate Psychology Alliance talks about is radical hope. So we've got to move away from this, oh, this will fix it, this will save us. That communication is dangerous. We have to think about what we really mean by resilience, and some of that means facing this despair, this depression, this failure, and we have to face up to our failure. That creates true resilience. I want to talk about the importance of external resilience as well as internal resilience, which is the external practical journey and the internal emotional journey. And what that creates is sustainable resilience, sustainable activism, sustainable engagement with this in the long term. It's only through going on that journey down into our failure and our depression and where we've got this wrong that we will have a transformative agenda around this. We also need to listen to these younger generations. I did a lot of work last year with young people around what did they want from education for the future. And I just want to quote some of what these young people were saying to me. This was mixed age ranges between 12 and 16. And I do apologize, I did say I'd do this briefly. And this for me is brief. And what they said was that they needed lessons in the future. They needed education in things like house building, boat building, plant growing. They were very focused on the need to do that. But alongside that, they also said they wanted lessons in how to lobby government, how to talk to teachers who didn't believe in climate change, how to have difficult conversations with their parents, how to cope with the fact that they were the only child in their class that cared about climate and biodiversity crisis. So these children were talking, and they also said they wanted lessons in storytelling, and how to create new narratives, new stories to prepare themselves for the future world that they are inheriting. These children are online, they're fully informed around this. And if we don't do that and say sorry and actually join up some of the complexity of that and look at where we've failed in order to move forwards, we will not build a sustainable resilience.
Yeah.
I'll stop.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. All sorts of wonderful wisdom there. So now we are indeed on the last question, how we build resilience with students. And Caroline, we're going backwards now through the speakers, and Caroline's just given us a few words on that. So Justine, you're next.
Sure, thank you, Joy. Yeah, so I would say that resilience, that facing the truth gives us resilience, and it's living in the web of lies and denial that screws us up. So, I mean, I really hear what Caroline says about the depth of despair that young people are facing, but I feel that we really can't afford to shy away from really facing that reality because of this fear that people will feel suicidal. And I just want to tell a little story that might illustrate that. So after our second deep adaptation retreat, when I was probably in the place psychologically, the deepest place that I've got to in myself of like really facing the potential for human extinction. And in that space, I had a phone call with the editor-in-chief of Bloomberg, who you'd think would be one of the best informed people on the planet about this kind of thing. And he just kind of spun me this story that was just deeply convincing about how everything was actually fine. And at the end of this half-an-hour conversation, I started to think, have I made this up? It's like, is everything actually fine, you know? And that was more of a head fuck, if you excuse my language, than where I'd just gone from. So I kind of reached out to my community around deep adaptation, and someone sent me this really hard-hitting video to watch, and I watched it and I was like, oh, thank God, we are all gonna die. And, you know, I kind of make a joke out of it, but it was easier to face the possibility of extinction with truth and reality than it was to exist in the web of denial and lies that this incredibly convincing, well-educated person created. So I feel that the strongest resilience that we have is actually taking the bull by the horns and kind of facing the reality. Secondly, I think a really important aspect of resilience is about values and about spirituality. I mean, I think spirituality is important because it gives us the ability to make meaning out of disasters. It gives us an ability to face our own death differently. But also, more importantly, that it actually holds the seeds of a deeper transformation within it. So, you know, it's my belief that we cannot transform society unless it's built in recognition of the sacred interconnectedness of life. And I feel that that deeper vision of transformation, whatever language you use for it, that deeper vision is really important. And whether or not we think we'll see it in our lifetime, 7 generations hence, or not at all, it is a possibility. And I really feel that kind of sharing and weaving that vision of a different way to be that has that purity and sacredness and is returning to something original that's in the kind of original instructions for humanity and this earth. So kind of holding a vision of that deeper transformation, I feel, is really important, whether or not we think we can actually see it. And the other thing I think is, you know, related to that, is that nature is resilience, and like love of nature is something we need to be cultivating, and nature gives us resilience. And also action is resilience. You know, anxiety, I think from speaking for myself, like the best cure for eco-anxiety is just action, even if you know that action won't ultimately change anything, but just being able to make some contribution that's in line with your values enables you to live with integrity. And I'll just tell another very quick story around that. In some of the embodied exercises that we use, we kind of walk in our imagination these trajectories of collapse, kind of experiencing, you know, in our imagination what that might be like. And then we ask people to get in touch with their most deeply held values, and then to walk those trajectories again. And I believe that, and people have a very different experience, and I do feel that we need to practice living from a place of values when these disasters hit. So, you know, when we get to when we've got food in the cupboard and our neighbours haven't, and our neighbours are knocking on our door, what are we going to do? How are we going to access our deepest values and find them in that moment? And I do believe this is something that requires rehearsal, that we need to firstly get in touch with the values and then rehearse living from that place so we can live there no matter how tough things get. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Justine. That's fantastic. Now, Alison and Jem, I'm going to have to ask you to be super brief, otherwise I'll get in terrible trouble messing up my chairing of this session, not giving Alex enough time. So sorry about that, but if Alison could go first and just be...
Okay, I will try. Thank you. I'll try and be very, very quick. And some of the things I wanted to say have already been said as well. So I think curriculum fit for purpose, and that has to be driven by the needs of those 14-year-olds, those young people coming through. That's absolutely crucial. But listening to people talking, yes, we can talk about what needs to happen, but we also need to think about what leverage do we have? You know, where are the levers? Having these conversations is helpful and it's useful, but we have to have access those levers in order to bring about change. And so far, collectively, universities have failed, because academics have talked about climate change and have not been able to effect change. So I would ask you and urge you to think about what are those levers, and if you can't find them, create them. So again, look to Universities UK. And then just one small thing, because others have said the other things I wanted to say also, which is about, you know, Vice Chancellors could, instead of having adaptation, so forth, as an add-on, which it frequently is, you know, why not have that built into all aspects of the operation of a university, so that within every faculty, within every department, there is awareness of what is actually happening. And so you can build things into job descriptions so that people are thinking operationally in terms of, you know, when you're revising curriculum, for example, when you're doing assessments, you know, you can build in things like climate awareness. You can build these sorts of things in. I'll stop there because I know we're running out of time, and I think the discussion is probably potentially more valuable.
Thank you, that's brilliant. And Jem, the last word before we move into the discussion.
Thank you, yeah. I want to echo a few things that have been said. Some people think that resilience means bouncing back stronger, but definitely the kind of resilience we need now for all of us, not just students, it involves transcending our fears of loss and of death without resorting to escapism. And that means becoming better able to live with our own difficult emotions and difficult emotions in other people. And of course, there are lots of contemplative practices and traditions we can draw on for that. But also we shouldn't individualize resilience. And so it really does also mean becoming better at working in collectives for collective outcomes, including political activism. In terms of how to do this, I think we need to meet students without any of the sort of the legacy of hierarchy that we have, engage them as co-learners on this. We're going to learn about this together, and we should express that we don't know what to do. We should express our sadness, our grief, and other difficult emotions. We should say if we're finding it tough, and we should empathize with them as they, as young people, have drawn the short straw here, and they're in a worse situation with us, and that pains us. That's slightly different from saying sorry. I do want to avoid any sense of blaming generations, because otherwise then you fail to learn from centuries of struggle against the kind of behaviors and power structures that have got us into this mess. And of course, also we want to invite people away from intergenerational anger and blame, because that's painful for young people to live with, as well as possibly just creating more difficulties, more harm in future. But how to engage in that conversation, again, without using our power as educators, and actually being and leveling with students without hierarchy, is a really interesting thing for us to look at. Physical resilience, a lot of the basic skills, but at the same time, we've got to avoid the delusion that we can sort of individually prep our way out of this by growing our own veg in our back garden. We need action from governments at scale to try and reduce harm. And so, yeah, there's a whole political adaptation agenda. There's an activist agenda on adaptation, and we should definitely keep that open. I love the idea of actually inviting young people to co-create their own courses around this predicament we find ourselves in. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So thanks to all the speakers for all of that wonderful challenge and all the wisdom you've given us. And my goodness, there's loads of both of those things. And now I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Alex Bowles, who's going to manage the questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Joy, and to echo the thanks to our speakers. It's been a hugely interesting, challenging, disturbing hour or so that we've had so far. In a moment, I'm going to, because I'm conscious that we have a couple of students on the call, so I'll turn to Manveer or Amy in a moment, just to see if you have any sort of initial reactions on what we've heard and what students themselves sort of might be thinking, or just sort of to hear it directly from you. But just before I do that, if anyone does want to come in, if you either want to mention in the chat or if you want to raise your hand, you can find that in the participants list at the bottom. So just to make a signal to me so that I know to come to you. But as I say, I'll start by turning, if I may, to either Manveer or Amy, if one of you would like to come in.
Hello, can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, so I'm Manveer and I'm a student commissioner. I'm a student at the University of Warwick in my final year. And yeah, I'll try to keep this short, although there was a lot of interesting insight that I'd love to comment on. And on the topic of kind of telling the truth, I think that, as Alison, you mentioned earlier, it's important that we don't missell the qualifications that are being offered by universities. The value of the knowledge that we're gaining through these is not going to remain the same, particularly when we look at the kind of scenarios that we're talking about. And where might we derive greater value from certain existing qualifications as well as new qualifications that are geared towards survival in a post-collapse future? I think those are conversations that need to be had. And make no mistake, when we're on the topic of deep adaptation, words like survival represent a very possible reality. Caroline mentioned some really nice ideas that students that she interviewed had in terms of new suitable curricula. And as Jem said, I think we need students to co-create and co-design these processes in the futures that we want to see, break down those hierarchies. And I mean, I don't necessarily think that has to be as difficult, at least within small examples, as it might seem, because in taking the example of the commission, we have institutional commissioners that have years of experience behind them and are very used to, I imagine, being part of these hierarchies. But then we have students like me, part of this process, and I feel like we have constructive conversations that really do break down those hierarchies. And in terms of psychological barriers, yes, this is a difficult truth to make people aware of. There are well-documented psychological barriers towards accepting and acting on climate change in general. For those interested, I'm happy to link a well-cited article by Gifford summarizing what he calls the dragons of inaction. And as speakers have mentioned, we need to use our awareness of these psychological barriers in order to create a more suitable schema of responses, which I think will require some leadership. So particularly at the moment, we've seen that leadership and unprecedented action can come out at times of hardship. However, we've also seen that humanity can turn towards the most immediate and salient crisis, leaving climate change as a second thought. So I'm hoping that the leadership that we need comes before these tipping points, the point of no return. And I have to believe that this leadership and the solutions will arrive in time. I think optimism and the agenda of sustainability and sustainable development, they are crucial, because through the belief that we can strongly mitigate the worst impacts of climate change, and the fact that we need to embed an understanding of what this entails within students, I think we can then facilitate constructive discussions about dealing with adaptation whilst minimizing that despair that we've talked about. So yeah, there's just some thoughts from me. And thank you to our speakers.
Thank you, Banveer. Amy, I don't know whether you had any initial thoughts. Obviously, no pressure if you do. I've seen you unmuting yourself, so I'll let you come in.
Yeah, well, yeah, I'd like also to say thank you. There was so many interesting things. I guess I kind of fall in the category that some of you were talking about with young people, because I'm only 17 myself, looking into going to university. And I like the idea of a sustainable curriculum involving students' ideas and breaking down the barriers. I definitely think that that is a way to build psychological strength in students. And I think being truthful is definitely something that will also help with this. So educating other people from other subjects that you wouldn't necessarily link to the climate crisis to create the sustainable leaders for the future, I think is also definitely a brilliant idea. And just sharing this knowledge will just break down barriers even further and just allow more learning and just more development within society as a whole, not just within those who have the qualifications to know because they've done a climate-driven or a sustainability-driven course.
Thank you, really helpful on both points. And as I think sort of Steve mentioned, that idea of sort of supporting students to help construct the curriculum in the broader sense, and it not just being siloed into particular curriculum areas, I think is an incredibly important point. John, I see John Wincott, you wanted to come in.
Hi, thank you, Alex, and thank you to the speakers. That was very, very interesting. I suppose a couple of points, and I don't know if the speakers want to respond, is that I think if we look at the COVID crisis and the public response to that, it doesn't fill me with hope for the public response to climate change and the future we face with that. When the first thing that happened was that you couldn't get toilet roll because it had been bought. It doesn't lead me to believe that we're going to be moving towards a society where we actually do help each other out. It seemed to very quickly degenerate into every man for himself, and if I can buy 20 packs of toilet roll, I will. That's my first thought, if you like, or first question is, how do you think we'll actually react given the COVID lesson? The second is, if we look at the countries where COVID has been apparently captured and brought down in reasonably short order, those are fairly, let's say, undemocratic countries. So China, Korea, where there's been quite a lot of leadership from the top, driven very centrally. And if you look at countries like America and actually the UK for that matter, which are less so perhaps in many ways, there's been much less control over it. And I mean, in America, people are marching on the streets with guns because they want shops and hairdressers open again. In the UK, there are protests in parks about having to social distance. So again, looking at the methods that have worked for COVID, looking at learning from that, what can we take forward from that when it comes to climate change?
Absolutely. And I think the way in which universities and colleges have almost completely changed their business model in the space of, well, initially changing it almost entirely within sort of a couple of weeks. Obviously, that's continued to develop over the last 10 weeks here in the UK. And I suppose it is then worth thinking about what might institutions be able to now do differently. So that point that Justine was making about, we've had that sort of stop moment almost, and now thinking about what we can sort of take forward into the new normal and how we define a new normal as not simply being returning to the old one. Did any of the speakers want to come in response to John's question? Alison, I see you raising.
Yeah, thank you. Briefly, I mean, the sort of notion that people panic buying is quite an interesting one, and I did actually read an analysis of this which suggested that it wasn't necessarily panic buying per se, but what people were doing was responding rationally to what they perceived as a shortage. So that's just a different way of framing that response, but it's a way, I think, that gives us possibly a little more optimism than you were suggesting, John, in terms of how people might respond in a crisis. The second point is, for me, I think the way that academics responded to the crisis showed me that academics can transcend those institutional operational system barriers. And the example I'd like to give is my former colleagues from the Knowledge Media Institute at the Open University, who very quickly came up with an app that could be used in to deal with the pandemic. But it showed that people can respond very, very quickly. So we can transcend barriers, and that gives me a sense of optimism about what we can do. But those are just two brief comments.
Absolutely, thank you. I completely agree. Yeah, we've shown that we can do it. Now let's see how we can take this forward. Jem.
Yeah, to echo that point, I mean, COVID has definitely shown to me how adaptable my colleagues are, and family, and many people. And also there's a wonderful website called Karunavirus. That's the Sanskrit word for compassion. Karunavirus.org, showing about what amazing stuff is being done. So we don't know what the future holds in terms of how societies will react. I think we do know that the best and the worst of humanity exists today, and it will exist in future. So it's more a question of what do we do to try and reduce harm, rather than sort of predict what will happen. I can see, John, how you were looking to sort of analyze what might be the general result from humanity in order to then think what a political system might be useful. But I think I would disagree with you that authoritarian countries have done better. You just have to look at many countries like where I am now in Indonesia, a large democracy, or with lots of local government democracy too, or New Zealand, for example, doing very much better than authoritarian countries. So I think we've got to be careful of not just cherry picking data. I think we just have to, we should not say that, well, needs must, and therefore we'll drop what we believe in. Actually, for me, deep adaptation is about not going down that path of saying, well, we can't care for each other in that way anymore because it won't work. It's actually inviting us to think, well, what is it we most believe in? We want to keep no matter what happens. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you. I can't see either Caroline or Justine waving at me, so I'll see if there are any other comments from people raising hands. I think one of the things that sort of struck me was particularly sort of Alison's challenge around how we as a sector are able to rise to the challenge, I suppose. And obviously, Joy as a Vice Chancellor, I'm aware that there are a couple of other heads of institutions on the panel, so I'm not sure whether either Steve, Judith, or indeed Joy wanted to come in about how are we able as institutions to respond to some of the challenges that have been sort of put to us by some of the speakers. Steve, I can see you now, so I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Alex, and can I thank our speakers enormously, really, because I think it's been a really fascinating discussion. My particular interest in this is I do believe critically that we will need a values-led curriculum co-constructed by students, and I've in all of my work professionally in my entire career, but particularly in the last 2 or 3 years, every single engagement I've had with them, it seems to me if we're not going to do that, that we're going to really struggle. I agree with Caroline, and I don't think this is just at the FE-HE interface. I think this is with primary and secondary And in fact, I think it's even more important. One of the things I've been most impressed with is in Portsmouth, a young social entrepreneur at 12 found out that the grant for Student Voice was going to be cut. So he set up a social enterprise, raised the money himself to do this. And Hayden's the most remarkable person, and Locke is as well. And interestingly, at least 50% of that dialogue over the last 6 to 8 years has been around the issues that we've been talking about today, climate change and young people's mental health and the critical link between it. So I think it is possible, and that's happening across a whole city in Portsmouth, and I think that's improving the quality of education, the respect for young people, and it's set an agenda about co-construction around not just student voice, but around the curriculum in a wider sense as well. Because unless we get this embedded and integrated into the mainstream curriculum, because as long as it remains a bolt-on, we will not be effective in this area. So I'd like to thank our 4 speakers particularly for their humanity in the way that they've raised that today. And I found that really, really helpful.
Thank you, Steve. That's incredibly powerful. And certainly that echoed much of what sort of Caroline was saying in terms of embedding it within her own curriculum as well. Other comments? Would people sort of like to come in? Is there, I suppose one of the challenges is how we turn an incredibly challenging discussion into something which institutions can then sort of practically do something about. And as perhaps been reflected, this might perhaps be slightly easier given where we are in terms of showing that it's possible. But I suppose, are any of these conversations happening within your institutions in terms of what might happen when we get through, whatever through means, through the current crisis? Are institutions looking at what lessons can be learned? Are institutions thinking about the kind of challenges of how we respond to the climate crisis in a way that we've now seen what can be done? Carl, I see you've put in a question. I don't know if you wanted to come in at this point. Otherwise, I've seen that Judith is putting on her microphone as well. So Carl, I'll come to you first and then to Judith.
Hi there. Yeah, so I've been leading, I'm at the University of Aberdeen, I'm the Senior Vice Principal there, and I've been leading our response to the COVID emergency, both in terms of getting everybody off campus and now I'm planning everybody to get on campus. We launched our Aberdeen 2040 strategy in February, and that was all about, had a big section on sustainable. And we then thought, what are we going to pause through this crisis and what work are we going to keep doing? And one of the very few things that we kept doing in terms of formal committees and so on was our working group on how we would deliver our commitments under Aberdeen 2040 under sustainable. Because we actually think that what this has done is allow some turbocharging of thinking that perhaps might not have been possible before about, for example, the carbon footprint of our staff. You're all now at home, you know, so we're already developed a working from home policy that we didn't have before. We imagine a larger number of staff will work from home on a much more ongoing basis. We think fewer students will travel. There'll be opportunities for students to study with us in ways that they weren't able to before, and that's likely to be ongoing and sustained. We have started to look at our capital development plan, which tended to focus on buildings, offices for growth and so on. And now we're thinking, actually, do we need to invest in other things? You know, we've seen really an opportunity for the two things to go hand in hand, our recovery, but also a real long-term focus on sustainable and net zero and so forth. And we're also working in partnership with the City Council, who sees it in exactly the same way. So we've had a number of conversations while we've cut a lot of, you know, standard meetings with people around the sector and so forth, just to try and concentrate on getting through. That's a set of conversations we have not paused. It's a set of conversations that actually we've taken forward, and the City Council of Aberdeen has also launched its own climate proposals only in the last 10 days that they had been struggling to get through as well. So I think that there are many more opportunities now. Suddenly the things that were unthinkable, things that you couldn't possibly envisage people being prepared to give up, suddenly people have done without those things for months. Large gatherings, which we all know, you know, there's a lot of talk about rock concerts and what, you know, how they could reduce their carbon footprint back in February and January. Well, they certainly have now, and I don't think it would be easy to go back. Suddenly, maybe the things that were absolutely a part of what we regarded as our way of life are now questioned, and people want to spend more time at home. Some people are enjoying that opportunity. So I don't think it's all doom and gloom. I think it does create the opportunity for radical thinking to enter the mainstream and for us to think through things in a completely different way that was just unthinkable before.
Thank you. That's hugely inspiring, and I suppose there's a question back to us in terms of universities as thought leaders, in terms of how we can then sort of take those messages out, and the work that you're doing with Aberdeen City is hugely important, and something we can then think about how we can encourage other institutions to think similar. Judith.
Yes, thanks. I just wanted to, I was going to say almost the same thing as Carl, but replace Aberdeen with the word Plymouth, because we've done exactly the same. All the work's carried on, all the work with the city's carried on, and business as usual has carried on in terms of what we normally talk about and plan for in the future. We have a 2030 strategy, so exactly the same, and exactly the same in terms of working with our city. Just wanted to come back to the point of research in universities. There is now a working party between BAYS, UKRI, a task force which is looking at research across universities and the funding of it going forward. And certainly that's not just about how do we do research on pandemics in the future, that's entirely around what will be the priorities for research going forward, how to make sure the funding for those priorities are right, how to make sure that the structures are for research going forward are in the right place. EAUC is supporting that task force, and I'm on the subgroup for EAUC for that task force. And I can absolutely reassure you that the discussion is about research in the future and the role of universities as research institutions and their contribution to the broadest area of research, including sustainability and climate, and also the role of universities in recovery plans for their regions. I'm a member of the board of our local LEP, which is Heart of the Southwest, that covers Devon and Somerset. That recovery plan is all about not just productivity and employment, etc. It's all about sustainability, green futures, which were all part of the plan in the first place before COVID struck. So nothing has stopped in terms of that conversation. And all of the local economic partnerships are working on their recovery plans at the moment. And economic sustainability is utterly alongside sustainability of the environment and response to climate. And that includes in whole areas around infrastructure, transport, etc. Lots of people have talked about institutions at universities as though they're the only ones who think up curricula. Actually, I don't think up any curricula in my university. That's entirely done by the staff. What they choose to teach and what courses we put on come entirely from our academic staff, except in the case of all of those courses that are accredited by other bodies, not least all of our teacher training. So co-constructing curricula with those responsible for our curricula for teacher training, which don't come from our academics in that sense. The curricula for our engineering, professional accreditations, all of the joint engineering boards, the requirements they have for our curricula and how to engage them in the co-construction going forward of the accreditation, all of the accreditation for lawyers, all of the accreditation for all of our health workers, medics, dentists, healthcare, nursing, etc., is all accredited curricula. So we mustn't think of ourselves as somehow the drivers of curricula as institutions. Our academics drive curricula for what courses we run,
And they are, you know, they're always changing programs. Many of them are changing programs live today. But we also have to engage in this conversation all of these other bodies who are responsible for accrediting curricula. We haven't mentioned them at all yet. And we probably need to know some of the barriers that they create to create curricular change. And in the past, that's not necessarily the case now. When you're trying to get sustainability into some of the engineering curricula, there isn't time to do that. We need our engineers to do nuts and bolts. So that's changed, and I've seen that change over the years from teaching cross program modules myself. But I think we have to understand that curricula don't come from the top of an institution. In fact, I've never told anyone what to put in their curricula. They come from the academic staff, and they come from all of those bodies to whom we are delivering and encouraging students to go and work. And I think we need to have a much broader discussion of this before we, and certainly students, but others need to come into this conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Judith. That's an incredibly valuable reminder of the role of professional bodies, but also how we sort of can speak with our staff as well, and particularly, I suppose, building on Caroline's point earlier around the way in which students themselves really seem to sort of value it being embedded within the curriculum, and how we can sort of get those messages out there. I can't see anyone else trying to raise their hand, and I'm conscious that we have 3 minutes.
Sorry, I have raised my hand. Could I, if nobody else wishes to speak, I'd like to respond to the previous two individuals, if nobody minds. I want to say something which I will say bluntly, and please forgive me for speaking bluntly, but this is an emergency. I'd like to remind everyone of something that Lord Stern said, which is that publicly, the public have little awareness of the scale of the challenge that we face. And with due respect to Judith and to Carl, I feel that responses which seek to try to persuade ourselves and others that we are taking action, doing the right things, are helpful, and they're positive. But the thing is, that's what we've done over the decades. And I think that without a profound awareness and acceptance of the scale of the challenge, my fear is that we're simply tinkering with the edges, and that we're tinkering with the existing beast, which doesn't work. So what I'm saying is that for me, a reformist agenda is simply not going to, it's just not going to work. I'm looking for something transformational. I'm looking for leadership where individuals are actually challenging preconceptions about the very fact that we have qualifications. So you've rightly talked about the role of regulatory bodies, the professional bodies and so forth, the QAA, which sets the curriculum. Will qualifications be of value in the future? Will they? We don't know. Yeah, I think we need a much more creative, transformational conversation, because otherwise the risk, and it's a significant risk, is that we regress to conversations that we know how to have, that are comfortable for us, that leave us with that nice, soft, fuzzy feeling that we are taking action. And it's not to say that you're not doing this with the best of intentions. It's just, it's not going to be enough. And I'm sorry to put it so bluntly. And, you know, if anyone wishes to challenge me on that, by all means do so. I've no wish to offend anyone, but I'm sorry, this is a really serious situation.
Can I come back on that?
Yep, Carl.
So I'm not at all offended. I think what I said in my remarks was that precisely COVID-19 allows a much more, the opportunity for transformational thinking to take up that challenge that you're saying. So I think it's a key moment because of its such wide-ranging impacts. It does make the unthinkable thinkable. So I understand what you're saying. Yes, there are some things that we were planning to do and we will continue doing, but our strategy was already seeking to get a transformation. It was seeking to make sure that the whole university's future was framed in the light of the climate emergency. That is a conversation that we had as a university over the last year that we had not had before. So I'm a bit more optimistic that people at least are getting to the first base that you're trying to get them to do, which is to say, it's terrible. It is an absolute catastrophe facing us. That's the first stage. Then to think through, well, what do we do in response with our students is something that I think we're now much, we were committed to that anyway, but it becomes easier as someone trying to lead that agenda within the organization to have those more radical conversations than it would have been even 3 months ago.
Thank you. I'm going to hand over to Joy in a second, but I think Caroline just wanted to make a very quick point before I do. But yes, thank you all very much for your contributions. Caroline.
Thank you. I'll try and keep it very brief. I want to speak to what I've just been hearing from a number of people. And what I've been hearing is this tension between the optimism versus the pessimism. So I just want to speak to what I've been hearing. And again, I spoke about this earlier. This is a false binary. So we should not be looking for either or solutions, but we need to notice and pay attention when we are pulled towards an optimistic frame, because that moves us dangerously away from the reality. So we need to stay within the reality rather than get split into the optimistic, pessimistic narrative. We need both and, not either or. We should not be minimizing despair. We need to accept the despair, and we need a global framework in which to do this, because it is already too late for large percentages of the world. So it is already too late. We need to accept that it's already too late for them, and we have a collective sense responsibility for these people, and that should be moving us towards moving beyond and here's the making ourselves feel better about these are things we can do, and that's the despair that we've got to manage in order to do that. This is about wisdom rather than cleverness, so we need a wise approach to this, and universities are not always keen on wisdom because wisdom is rather complex and it's not clear and it can't be measured in the same way, but we need wisdom, and we need to be focused on what we need to do rather than what we want to do, and that means moving the narrative. I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Then just forced me to say a few words in closing. Most importantly, I want to thank people. So thank my colleagues who set up this meeting. I want to thank all the participants. It's really been important to have you all here listening, and for some of you who've been able to contribute, thank you for that. And especially, of course, our warmest thanks to our speakers who did exactly what Caroline just said, brought so much wisdom to us. The motto from my own university is in Old English, wisdom on law, which means wisdom and learning. And I think actually that's a motto that every university should live by. So for me, two key words today from our speakers, that they gave us wisdom and they gave us challenge. And all of that is so much appreciated. And what I want to say to you speakers and the rest of you is this will not go into a black hole. The commission is going to go away, going to distill, going to think, going to discuss. And we very much hope there will be practical outcomes emerging of all sorts. And we hope that that will allow more radical, transformational higher education in the future. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Joy.
Thank you, Joy, and everyone.
Thank you, Jem.
Thanks, Joy. Thanks, everyone. Great set of questions.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
Thanks, Joy. Thanks, Fiona.
Welcome. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks,
Wasn't it
Steve.
good?
Fantastic.
Yeah. I struggled with the technology at the beginning. I couldn't get any sound for 12 minutes, but I'm so glad I persevered. I thought the inputs and the speakers were terrific.
They were fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah. And there was just one or two defensive items at the end, but I expected that to happen.
Yeah.
No, really, really good. Thank you both very, very much. Catch up with you later.
See you later. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Well done, Fiona, and see you shortly.
Yeah, see you for the next round.
Okay, in about an hour, I think, isn't it? Yeah.
Yep. See you in an hour. All right. Thanks, Joy.
Bye.